Good morning. I'll call to order the Board of Finance Purchasing Policy Committee special meeting. Board members are Lori Charlton and Chris DeWitt. Thank you for everyone who else is in attendance. I see Courtney, I see Joe Santafanti, I see Mr. Bremer, and I'm sorry, I forget.
Adam Toolin.
Thank you. Sorry. Having one of those days. So today, what we were hoping to get through. So Jen sent out a 2-hour meeting. I just want to make it clear right now. I have 1 hour to dedicate to this, and I'll dedicate all of this 1 hour that I can certainly do that. If the rest of the team wants to stay in for the second hour, I'm more than happy to leave the communication open and go from there. So current status, I provided a document, which was some handwritten notes that I incorporated into the Word document, the latest document that Joe had sent me. They were attached to this meeting notice. Second data point is are the inputs that Courtney had provided in regards to the Board of Education changes. So today's meeting, I think there's a couple important things that I think we really need to get through. Certainly to look at the Board of Ed changes kind of it holistically, right? But what I'd really like to get through too is what is that tact, how often we're going to meet on this to drive this to closure, and maybe we even put a stake in the ground when we think we can finish this. And my other goal at the end of this meeting is to make sure that Mr. Santafanti and his team has everything they need that they can move forward with this change. Because you know, when we started this process, I wasn't working and I had a lot of time to work on it, and now I don't. So and it's a lot of time to get through this stuff. So that's what I'd kind of like to touch on today. Lori, did I miss anything, or would you like to add anything?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I feel like we need a little bit of a reset today with you know, Gerald's departure and Adam on board. And welcome, Adam. We're excited to have you here. I think we've you know, we may have lost some momentum and potentially lost some things in translation. So for me, I think one of the key things is to agree on a timeline and a schedule so that we can get this thing done. And also a process for how we're going to accept any additional feedback and changes. I think that would be helpful. We have right now, I think attached to the meeting, there were 2 different drafts, one that had Chris's changes and one that had Courtney's changes. And so as to avoid confusion, I hope we can have one individual in charge of the master draft. And then as we move forward and we have these discussions, agree on a process for how changes will get incorporated and agreed on, and how we come up with the final product for to get to the Board of Finance for a vote.
Yep, perfect. So those are pretty much my comments as well. So Adam, maybe to bring you up to speed a little bit. So this process, it's been taking a long time. I don't want to harp on that, but what has happened is there was an original draft of a purchasing policy that was created by your predecessor, Mr. Foley. I reviewed it, Ms. Charlton reviewed it, and we had some issues with it and had some major changes. At that point, the Board of Finance, and it was the entire board, thought that it was better for Mr. Santafanti and his team, having had experience with purchasing policies and exposure to a lot of other municipalities, kind of take over the document and put some real world examples and give us put some meat around the bones, right? And he did that, and that's the document we have today, and we were iterating that document. it became clear very early on that there was a gap between Mr. Foley's interpretation of some of this document and central office, aka Courtney's interpretation of the document. So our last meeting, which was on, I wrote it down here somewhere, a year ago, darn near. Oh no, what? Well, maybe it was. So we met in person to go page by page through and cross this off. And again, we became aware of the fact that we were the Board of Ed was in a transition between superintendents, and there was a lot of other reasons why we didn't have really quantitative or qualitative input to the document. So Courtney has since provided that document. I've got that document here, which I'll share. And I think what might be the best use of our time today is to look through those changes and see if there's any real major disagreements. And I also think that what would be really helpful is, frankly, I want to be sure and that everyone understands. I personally don't feel a need to be involved in every discussion with this policy. I don't think Lori does either. So the most, if Adam and Courtney can get together and come through and jam into one big document, all the changes, and you guys are all good with it, then our committee would be happy to then really do what we're supposed to be doing, which is reviewing the document, making changes. Wherever you two maybe can't decide, we're happy to be the mediators there and make a decision.
Yeah.
But the end goal here is to get a document to the, through our committee, then to the Board of Finance, and have that all wrapped up.
Chris, if I might, I do think that, Adam, I don't want to speak for you at the town or for Tom, but I do think with that fresh set of eyes and with having worked with Adam for a brief period of time, that I think it will be really, I don't want to say easy, but it will be a process that I'll gladly, share my input and take the direction from Adam with his expertise. So I do think it will be beneficial for us to get together and draft something. And I'll take your lead, Adam, but I do think we can move this forward. I think Adam's got he's got the experience that will help us shape this pretty, I think, easily.
And I just want to say one thing, maybe for the record. I don't know that anybody I'm not sure if anybody from the public is interested in this, but part of the reason we're here, or the reason that this came to the forefront to begin with, and maybe just for Adam's benefit, in case he's not up to date with the history, is that we did have an audit done of the DPW department. I think the report was issued 3 years ago. And within that audit, there were a number of findings, pretty serious findings around our purchasing practices and violations of those practices. And, also just some items where conclusions couldn't be reached because there wasn't even information available to support what had been done. So one of the big focuses of the initial policy that was drafted with Mr. Centifanti's help was to make sure that the new policy that was being put in place could be mapped to and address all of the audit findings that came up. So that was really important to Chris DeWitt and I, and that was sort of the reason that, after the first policy by Mr. Foley, after we looked at it, one of the things we struggled most with was trying to understand how that policy would address the issues that were identified. So I think the draft that's in place now does that. And I think, and I don't want to speak for Courtney, but I think part of what we've struggled with since then is maybe part policy, but part operational issues, and trying to make sure that the policy is clear and allows things to happen in an efficient way that protects the town. So I think those two things are separate, policy and operational issues, but they can become entwined when the policy is unclear, and then the operational issues sort of, turn into a quagmire, as tends to happen quite a bit. So that's where we are. So I think from our perspective, the Board of Finance, we really just wanted to make sure that the policy supported all the, addressing all the audit findings, and that there are appropriate internal controls in place to make sure that the policy is actually being followed. Both, preventive sort of internal controls and what I'll call detective internal controls, which includes reporting to, informational reporting to the Board of Finance and others, so that, any anomalies would be highlighted. So just some additional background, but I think that's important.
And Chris, might I add just one minor thing also?
Please.
Okay, and Adam, you and I haven't been able to speak about this yet, but also one of the Board of Ed, our concerns was, in addition, it's been addressed, I believe, in the updated version, but some parts were in conflict with statute. So for example, need for town approval for contracts over $100,000. That's just one example. But I think that's something that we can easily work through. And my suggestions mainly were for my updated suggestions. The reason I didn't redline the existing version was the bulk of my suggestions were to, in my opinion, streamline the document so that it was easy to follow. And then we're not married to any of the thresholds. That was something I thought we could have as part of the conversation.
Yeah, there's definitely some outstanding, first of all, there's some outstanding issues that are highlighted in yellow that you'll see going through the document. But yeah, so again, for let's see, for Adam's benefit, the big deal for me was, again, statutes and issues where central office either doesn't have to go through our purchasing organization or can waive bids or whatever like that. But overall, the real biggest issues for me have been bid waivers and sole source, right? And I think that's kind of the crux of the issue here. And I think getting the Board of Ed stuff aligned with the policy, I think gets us like 75% of the way there. And then there will be, the last 25% for me is thresholds, because the thresholds have not been clearly established. They've been established, but they haven't really been explained to me, at least, that where I'm comfortable with them. And then other issues that have something to do with the whole process, not just exclusive to the Board of Ed.
Go ahead.
Okay, I was just gonna, before we get into, if I could, before we get into discussing any specific changes, Chris, can we just have some clarity around how we're gonna manage these changes? So I know you and I talked about this a little bit, but who is keeping control of the draft, and what's gonna be the process for, changes to be submitted and implemented so that they, then can be distributed back to the committee? I just don't want to leave that to the end, sort of process and timeline for how we move forward.
Yeah.
Well, if I just want to talk about process a little bit. I listen to everybody, and I just want to throw in my 2 cents. I think you're right. I think we should definitely establish some more meetings, because let me back up. What I heard is we should really meet with the town should meet with the Board of Ed and see what we can work out on our own. And for the issues that remain, where we have a disagreement, we need to come back to the subcommittee for your input, that sort of thing. I think that's great. I think we should do that. And I agree with Courtney, at least what I heard, which is I don't think these are big deals. I think we can work out a lot of this stuff between the two of us, the two organizations. At least that's my sense. Look, there's going to be some issues that we're gonna disagree on, and we're gonna basically leave to the Board of Finance, and you're gonna make a decision one way or the other, and we hope, you know, that we can get through that. So I think for timeline, I would suggest that, the Board of Ed and we meet, we see what we can hammer out. It's March, we see by the end of March where we are. I think to end this, I'd like to end this before July 1st. I think the first thing that we need to discuss between us and the Board of Ed is it's really hard to work with 3 different documents and try to, what about this and what about that? We're gonna bring this in. We should start with one document, and the document I wanna start with is the document that we've been working off of. And to the extent we need to make changes, we should just have one document. And to follow up on what you said earlier about what, this document that we're working off on Joe and Gerald's other document, we took the position here in town, I did with Gerald, saying, forget your document. We're just gonna work with Joe's document, and there is no other document. And so, to the extent we need to make changes, I just wanna make one change to one document. And to get to your other question, which I think is excellent, Lori, as well, which is, okay, who's gonna be the keeper of the document? Because as we go through this, I realized from the pages that we went through in the last meeting, I've got a bunch of notes scribbled on all these pages, but I don't have the definitive, what was agreed to, where are we, with that sort of thing. So I think between Courtney and I, and with Adam's expertise, we can sit down and go through it page by page. Okay, can we live with this? Can we live with that? And then I'm hopeful that at the end of that, we can then present it to you and say, okay, we've got 5 issues that are open, or 6 issues, whatever it is. And you can then sit there and go, okay, we agree with this, we don't want to do that, and we agree with this. And everything you said earlier, Lori, about the audit of DPW and stuff, we all agree with. I mean, I want this document. Look, part of the audit also it made everybody focus on the old purchasing policy, which is 3 pages long, which had a lot of holes in it. And so we needed to update that, and I think this does that, and I think this does address a lot of the DPW audit issues. So I think that's where we should go next. That's my 2 cents.
So,
Yeah, no, thank you. Can I just follow? I do want to, include one important person in this process, and that's Joe Centofanti, because whether we ask Joe to maintain the official draft, which I think actually might be a good idea because there's, for other reasons, but I do want to make sure that to the extent changes are agreed on between the town and the Board of Ed, or any changes are made, that Joe has a view of those as well, because I think it gives everybody comfort that any changes are made. He's got an appreciation of what those are, and we aren't inadvertently changing anything that would impact what we're really trying to get here, which is a tighter policy and a better set of controls that addresses the issues that were identified. And I know we've had some discussions about that in the past. Some of us may have found a certain aspect of what was written down objectionable. And then, Joe was able to explain why that was important. And so I think, the draft, any changes need to be redlined between versions. I would just like to get Joe's input that there's, nothing that the Board of Finance needs to be concerned about any of those changes. And then I think to the point everyone's making, if you guys agree on changes, Joe's okay with them. Chris and I, let's just see the red line, and that's great. And then, if there's changes that we can't agree on for some reason, again, I'd like to get Joe's input. Now, there may be things that he doesn't really have a view on because they're just operational issues and not really kind of internal control issues. But I would, in fact, like to make sure that we include him in the loop on any, any issues where there might be debate or disagreement. I think that's really important. So, Chris, it's really up to you in terms of how this document gets controlled. But I think I heard from you that you don't want to be the keeper of it. So I think and I heard from John that there's some confusion on what the current draft is. So whatever the official current draft is, and Chris, I thought that was the one that you marked, you distributed.
Yep.
You had marked up. So you took notes from our last meeting. You marked up and made some changes from Joe's most recent draft. That's got to be the starting point. And whoever's going to maintain that, you know, I'll leave that up to the group. But, you know, I think the process of how we, you know, accept those changes, how we review the changes and how we move forward is an important one, along with what Tom said, which is, you know, timeline, target dates, next steps. And I don't think we should leave this meeting without scheduling the next one also, I would say.
So to the topic of the official document, in the meeting that Jen Carpenter sent out today, which you should all see on my screen, there is a file called Fairfield Update Draft of Purchasing Policy, spelled wrong, 3/21/23 Rev A. That is Joe's document that he had sent me in Word. I incorporated the written notes that I had from our last meeting, which are not voluminous by any stretch. We got through like 20 pages, right? And then Jen PDF'd that. That is our baseline, right? Now, and Jen has a Word version of that as well. So that would be the document we would start with. That would be the document that we would update to include the Board of Ed changes. So that is our baseline. There is no more updated version than that. That's one. Two, I like your proposed timeline, Mr. Bremer, that the end of March, the town and the Board of Ed come together and deliver a single document to my committee that says, here are all of our changes, you know, put track changes in Word, and anywhere where there's disagreement or where there needs to be a ruling from this committee be highlighted in yellow or whatever, right? The current document does have some highlighted yellow things in there, like the caps on when we need a PO or when we need a bid and those kind of things. So there's other issues there. But if you can deliver that document to our committee by the end of March, I think that's perfect. I also like the end of July to be complete with this whole document. So that gives us an additional 4 months to get through our committee, you know, resolving our committee reviewing, our committee reconciling any of the disputes, make sure all the yellow comments are cleared, and we don't meet in July, but that the goal could be our June meeting to have this on our agenda and vote on this. So I like that timeline.
Chris, I see Mike's hand up. Mr. Testani has joined us.
Oh, I see. Hi, Mike.
Hi, I apologize. I was having technical difficulties trying to get on.
All right. Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's fine. I just, you know, before we get too deep into it, and it may have been already discussed, I'm not sure if it was brought up. I think one of the things, and I know I'm fairly new still here in Fairfield, but there are some things that are common from the other side of the line when it comes to purchasing, and some of the frustrations that I think we experience on a Board of Ed side that are a little bit unique. And I'm sure everyone's aware by now that, you know, timelines are very critical, especially when there are things that need to be done, you know, during the school year or during the summer. So getting approvals quickly on items that we will need either to implement teaching and learning at the start of a school year or during the school year are time sensitive. As you know, for any work, when it comes to maintenance and facilities, that 2-month timeline of the summer to have those all lined up, so that contractors, the day kids walk out the door, are able to begin, and we don't lose any critical time waiting for POs to be issued. But I think one of the things that also becomes problematic at times, and we end up usually working them out, but unnecessarily, there are things that, you know, someone will ask, because I've had this happen in the past, well, why don't we just go out to bid for that? there are services that are offered by hundreds and thousands of companies and vendors throughout the country, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way to go. So for example, you're bringing in a program that does X. Yeah, there's 1,000 vendors that do that, but once we have vetted the pros and the cons through committees and things of that nature to choose one that fits the needs of the school district, even though they may be could be slightly more expensive, the product itself is different, even though it falls under the umbrella of, a communications to families, possibly, a platform that does that. We're currently doing that now. So I just think those are some critical items, because I heard you mention, sole source and things like that, that we try to be very diligent. At least I know in my experience, I try to make sure that not only do we get great pricing, but we also get a product that's going to be useful by staff, students, families, whomever. And it's not just going to sit on a shelf, or it becomes more of a hindrance than it does a help to, and it doesn't meet the needs of what we're trying to accomplish. So those are just some things I just want people to be aware of, that we're trying to be very diligent in how we choose vendors, but we're also being very cautious and careful on how the cost may be impacted. We're going back to all our vendors currently to make sure, as we purchase, for example, new Chromebooks for the district, that we get the best pricing possible, not just going back to the vendor that we've been using for the last 10 years, but, bringing in some competitiveness there to make sure that we are getting the most bang for our buck.
And could I just add that, if you don't mind, also, in addition, what Mike has been speaking about, I think Adam and I have set up weekly meetings. And I noticed that you sent with the attached backup summary of like bid waivers and sole source and bid exceptions. And I want to really acknowledge that and say we're appreciative of that. And that's like a high level of acknowledgement that there are some unique things that are related to the Board of Ed that we want to be codified in policy, so that we're treating it appropriately. And that it might need a set of different rules. So I noticed that you broke out the settlements, for example, and we can have a conversation about some of the professional services, like Mr. Testani just mentioned. And, even in our experience just to date with working with Adam, some of the things that he's pointed out and helped us with are appropriately within the realm of, I don't want to belabor the point, but are appropriate from a purchasing perspective. And we're looking forward to having the purchasing manual reflect those unique pieces of our structure. So even, for example, tutoring services, I saw that broken out. We can talk to the town about what we need and how we can leverage Adam's expertise to do it well and not violate any of our, needs to respond to needs of IEPs, for example. But I feel as though, there's an understanding there and an acknowledgement that we need to apply that in the policy. And I think we'll be able to do that.
Yeah. No, understand. And I see Ms. Charlton, let me just make one statement. I'll call you. We've heard this before, Mr. Testani, and believe me, we understand the issues around a central office. It's this committee's, goal to have first off, to create a robust policy, right? I'm reading from a list I ginned up a little while ago. But we want to align around best practices. And that bid waiver list, that list was generated for us. And I'm quite amazed by the number of bid waivers, right? I think a lot of those should be sole source. And that's one of the things I really want to quantify in here, because there's a big difference between a bid waiver and a sole source. If you can justify a sole source, as Mr. Testani said, where you're balancing cost and value, right? And cost, you can also call value, you could call a benefit, right? So we have a OTPT outsourcing service that's $5 more expensive than all the rest, but they know us and we know them, and there's a benefit there. We want to be able to keep those people involved. There is some due diligence that central office would have to do with every X number of years. You say, guys, your prices keep going up. We might have to rebid every 2 years, whatever that is. But there's got to be, and that's the whole reason for this policy, to really define bid waivers and sole source and make sure they're categorized the right way. Because I agree with you, Courtney. That list of bid waivers is just ridiculous. And so when you sole source justify something, you should be able to get around that. So I think we're all in agreement. And then the last part that I think affects the Board of Ed more than anyone else is, let's make sure we're in alignment with state statutes. If state statute says that we have a special education program that has to have this people, whatever, aligned, then we have to be in compliance with that. But at the end of the day, I don't want anybody to forget that the purchasing authority of this town is the guy in the blue shirt sitting next to Bremer, right? He is the purchasing authority. And ultimately, this policy has got to give him and his department the flexibility to allow the Board of Ed to do what they have to do. So that's my speech. Ms. Charlton.
Yeah, I want to pick up a little bit on that, but I think, and let me just put it another way. When you see a list of bid waivers like the one we got, to me, it just indicates that something is very wrong. And this is where I think we need Mr. Centifanti's help a little bit. If we have, hundreds or thousands of exceptions to a policy, to me, that indicates one of two things. Either nobody's paying attention to the policy, which I don't think that's necessarily the case, or I think the policy is too broad.
Yeah.
And this is where we need to get to, a policy that puts everything subject to bidding based on just a dollar threshold, for example, is not a good policy. And one example I would give, because I think there's, when you look at that bid waiver listing, there's a lot of confusion, I think, based on how we define things. There are lots of things on there that are called sole source that are not in fact sole source. I would call them professional services, maybe, or we can come up with a different word. But, for example, and maybe this gets to Mr. Testani's point, when the town seeks to hire an attorney, we don't necessarily go out to bid for the cheapest guy who happens to have a shingle outside his door. We look for a certain level of expertise based on the nature of the matter that we need this attorney for. And so these things are not all about price. But we've it seems to me that we've grouped those things into sole source, because, like the situation Mr. Testani described, we've gone down a path and evaluated, let's say, a service or a product, where there are important criteria in addition to price. And we've come to a conclusion that this is the way we want to go. But then we classify that as sole source. That's not sole source. There are, in fact, multiple providers. But right. So I think we have a lot of confusion around the definitions that we're using. And then the definitions that things fall into drive the approval process. And that's what causes all the problems. Because if you say something's sole source and it really isn't, it's really, a bid for it's really looking for professional services, a software program, something else that's got to fit a certain set of needs. But you define it as sole source. Now you're going to get a whole bunch of questions around how it meets sole source criteria when in fact it doesn't, and it's not supposed to. So I think where we need to focus, and again, I hope Mr. Centifanti can help with this from a policy perspective, is to really sharpen those definitions so that it's crystal clear, what categories these things fall into, because the category that a purchase falls into is going to drive the approval process that it needs. And, that again is pretty important. I think that's the source of a lot of our issues here. The other thing is, we do have, required reporting to the Board of Finance and we have special approvals around things like waivers. Getting a list of hundreds or thousands of, POs is not helpful for us. Those aren't really things we're waiving. that the town is waiving. Bid waivers, true bid waivers should be rare. There shouldn't be a lot of instances where we're truly waiving our bidding requirements. Emergencies, yes, but there's still even some controls around that. So what I would encourage the group working on this to do, and please seek out Joe's advice on this, is to look at that bid waiver list, understand the types of things that we're actually dealing with, and make sure that we've got buckets defined that capture the everyday transactions that the town has, which we're currently now, quote unquote, waiving bid requirements. Because I think, again, we're usually waiving them because they just don't fit in our policy, because our policy has not been well defined. So I think that's incredibly important, and it ultimately, I think it drives a lot of the operational pain that we've been having around here. Poorly defined criteria leads to lots of questions, which leads to delay in getting approvals processed, which creates all sorts of headaches and, in fact, increased costs for the town overall. So if we can tackle that issue, that to me would be, the biggest. That I think was the biggest aha. Just looking at that bid waiver list is just understanding how much time we appear to be wasting by kind of going through this process that could be avoided if things were defined better.
If I could just add one piece to that too, is that, and I'll be brief, you'll see that we have over 100 tuitions and settlements, which if you counted them individually, they're all part of that bid waiver list. But really, as one whole, whatever you call it, they're exempt from bidding. So that's just an example. So the policy will address that. And I've suggested language that I can talk to Adam and Tom about that will help us to define that. And I think we can get to a place on that. One of the other challenges we found that I think it can be addressed in the policy, and we've seen Adam be amenable to this, was in the past, we had treated our RFPs or bids in some senses as a one-size-fits-all. So the weighting for the criteria, meaning the financial criteria, was standard, and sometimes you need to make adjustments. So you always need criteria for evaluation, but every bid isn't the same, to Mike's point and Lori's point earlier. So bids would be treated differently. We'd agree upon, through the guidance of the purchase department, what should be the appropriate criteria for bidding and the appropriate weighting points, but it wouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. So for example, financial information wouldn't be 25% of every bid, for example. That wouldn't be set in policy. It would be set in policy that you have criteria that you evaluate against, but not not the weighting of the criteria. That's just an example.
Yep. Agree. And again, the purchasing authority is the purchasing department, and this policy has to give that person who's ever in charge of that department, the flexibility and or the rigidity of a process or a policy that allows you to do what you need to do independent of the purchasing group, or where you're dependent on the purchasing group, right? I think we're all saying the same thing. Now, I'm willing to say, and I don't think was Prue taking notes, or am I the note keeper today?
She is. I think she is of the meeting. Not notes on the document, but notes of the meeting.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Perfect. Well, I'm gonna recommend to our committee that we accept those dates. And Laura, I guess it's just, since it's just you and I, that the first date that we memorialize is the end of March. So we'll call it March 30th. That the Board of Ed and town inputs combined, we'll supply a combined document to Mr. Centofanti with track changes in Word, so that he can keep that as the owner of the document, and that would include any of the other previous changes, which are very small in the document that I provided. And then in turn, Mr. Centofanti would provide that document to our committee for our next review and comment. And that our second memorial date would be the end of July, to be 100% and have the policy approved by the Board of Finance. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we're going to need some interim dates just to ask for these changes to come back to us and for us to give any, ask any questions or so, I think we may have other meetings, but I think at least the next date, I would suggest we perhaps have a meeting date where the idea would be to review any unresolved items that come out of the discussion. And if none, then that'll be a short meeting. But I think that's important. I think the other thing I just want to throw out here, and not to get into too much detail, but I think one of the items that came up recently was our credit card policy. And I don't want to get into the details on that, but I think it's important that this policy just referenced the incorporation of our credit card policy, because that is effectively just another way to pay for things that the town purchases. And so we just want to make sure that that's memorialized in there so that, credit cards are treated the same in terms of, approval requirements, et cetera. I think generally those are, used for smaller purchases, but obviously we want to make sure that that doesn't get missed, and that, we can't get around the purchasing authority by putting things on credit cards, basically. So I think incorporating that policy once it's finalized into this document, even if just by reference, would be helpful.
Well,
Agreed.
we can.
Sorry, go ahead, Mr.
I
Barber.
was just going to say, in terms of the credit card policy, I don't want to. That's a very sensitive subject here because we're doing an investigation. And you're absolutely right. I have no problem with referencing it here, as long as we all recognize that credit card, that policy gets changed by the town, and the town wants to continue to be free to do that, in the sense of maybe less people need them, maybe more people need them, but I'm very where we absolutely don't want someone using their credit card to get around the purchasing policy, obviously.
Right.
That's, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. So,
Right.
and to that extent, we want to incorporate it. You're absolutely right.
And that's all I meant, Tom. So the issue of, for example, who gets a credit card, if some common criteria is established for that, that's part of a credit card policy. But it just, the credit card policy shouldn't be in conflict with anything the purchasing policy requires, right? So I think incorporating it, just even by reference, it's a separate freestanding policy, but it can't override the purchasing policy, for example.
It should be subject to the purchasing policy.
Exactly. When I said before that I think 75% of this policy issue will all be cleared up when we get alignment between Board of Ed and the town, I still believe that, maybe even 80%. But that last 20 to 25% is going to be the things like code of conduct, purchasing, credit card, right? Listen, this policy should not say Tom Bremer shouldn't have a credit card, right? That specific role shouldn't have a credit card. That should come from HR. But because this is a purchasing policy, and because credit cards are used to purchase things, it's no different than writing a check or doing electronic transfer. It's the exact same thing. So it's just one more medium that has to be controlled within the purchasing policy. The who has it and how they're distributed and what happens if you don't use them the right way is completely an HR issue and should just be referenced in this document. So I'm with you, Mr. Bremer, 100%.
Okay.
So having said that about the interim dates, so I would propose that we also memorialize April 15th. So that would give us 15 days. We'll be past the budget process to have what I've written down as a resolution on the unresolved items list. So if on March 30th, you give us a document and you guys are all in agreement, and that April 15th meeting will be very short. If you have 3 or 4 or 5 things that need to be resolved, that'll give Ms. Charlton and I 15 days to come to a conclusion, ask who we've got to ask, get both sides of the opinion, and then make a resolution. And I'll propose that would be April 15th. And then May 15th, which a month later, would just be another update on overall progress. And at that point, I think that May 15th progress would be where is my committee or our committee coming on reviewing the document and making sure we're on a path to getting to the end of July. So that's 3 meetings. That's 3 meetings in the next 3 months, including March, right? And then date in July. So I think that's as far as I feel comfortable going out, and we can deviate off the 15th a day or two here, but depending on schedule.
Yeah, I
everyone
think we
agree
should
with that?
just maybe, well, for example, April 15th is a Saturday, but I think that's the general time frame sounds fine to me.
Right.
And I, maybe what we can do is, I guess what I'm not, first of all, 2 things. One, I want to make sure that Joe is also okay with this, because we're going to be reaching out to him on some of these items. And secondly, I do think we should actually schedule the next meeting of this committee. I know we talked about time frames, but I'm not sure what that means in terms of kind of an internal timeline versus a meeting schedule. So I guess first I would ask Joe if there's anything problematic with this schedule with him, knowing that, several parties may be reaching out to him for input.
I'm going to need time to review. So if you want it back on the 30th, I would need it before that. So that timing be delivered on the 30th, I would need some time to look at it. So that would push things a little bit, or will I get it before the 30th? So that's the one thing I'd want to clarify. March 31 will be a deadline day for me, so most likely would not look at it till after that day. And I could schedule it that week, but it's going to shorten your 2-week period if that's the timeline.
If on the 30th of March, a document, a combined document is delivered between the town and the Board of Ed, could we do a dual path? I mean, we could deliver it to you, Joe, for your review, and then we could do our review at the exact same time.
I was thinking the same thing.
Sure.
Yeah, Joe, if Chris and I and you all get it at the same time, and then we could schedule some time between then and April 15th to share any comments or questions and, ask for, and then figure out the resolution of open items.
Yep. No, that makes sense. So
Okay.
that'll definitely work. And I guess the one comment I want to talk about just throughout for professional services, because the recommendation, at least that I'm going to have, is some sort of bidding. So we talk about, we know this vendor, we vetted it and whatever. There's a process there to vet.
Right.
How do you know that's a good vendor? And it can't be, well, because I used them in my last district. That's not a good enough answer. So when we're looking at the professional services, agree it's not sole source, but what was that process? What is going to be the required process? What is going to be the documentation? How did you get to that conclusion that this is what's best for whoever?
Right.
So I think when you're looking at how you're updating and defining that, there still has to be a process. It can't be just, I like this vendor.
Yeah.
That's been a real problem for us in the past, in terms of the purchase. Now I'll put on my purchasing authority hat. Yeah, everybody, I shouldn't say this, but I will. It seems more often than not that, it's a professional service. Well, we've been using them for years and that sort of thing. And so, Joe's exactly right. That doesn't answer the question. That just begins, I think, the process. And I think, because what happens is, if we can't get in a state contract, we're going to push everything into professional services, because then I don't have to bid anything and I don't have to deal with anything. And that's always the yin and yang that purchasing has been put in the past. So I think, following up on Lori's comments earlier about definitions, I think definitions are critical. And I also think when I looked at the bid waiver lists and stuff, there were lists of, I mean, they're all technically quote-unquote bid waivers in a broad sense, but when we buy things off for the Board of Ed or for the town or for state contracts, it's technically a bid waiver, but it's absolutely
Yeah.
acceptable because we use the state contract. So I think definitions are critical, and I think that's something we need to work on in the new draft.
Yeah,
And can I just say, I didn't want to imply that there should be no bidding process for professional services. You know, my concern was more about how those are carved out and defined in the policy. You know, much as Joe indicated, right? Because right now, when I look at that bid waiver list, there's a bunch of things listed as sole source, which in fact, it's not sole source. There were multiple
Inaccurate.
vendors to choose from, but I think they fell more along the lines of professional services where a vendor was chosen for something other than pure price. So, you know,
Yeah.
to Joe's point, you know, there's a process around these things. And, you know, it could be, okay, and Mike, Mr. Testani, you know, a committee has decided that, you know, there's 5 critical criteria that need to be satisfied. And based on those 5 criteria, you know, there's a list of X number of vendors, and, you know, the criteria could be, you know, reputation, looking at their prior work, price, you know, evaluation through a demonstration, or, you know, whatever it might be, specific functionality of whatever product you're looking at. So it's not that there would be a complete absence of process around that.
Process, right.
But there does have to be a process defined. And then I think someone mentioned it, and I don't know who mentioned it, but you know, same thing we do with our auditors. You know, we have a process where we go out and rebid every 5 years. You know, even if we're very happy with the service we receive and the price and the, you know, fees are fair, we do have just a periodic process because, you know, we're a public entity here and that's the right thing to do. So, and in some cases that might not even be feasible. For example, if we, you know, have a significant investment in something, you know, like we're not going to go out and rebid, you know, using Munis every 5 years because you have an embedded, you know, investment in it, and it affects a lot of things. So I think there's a way to define these that's appropriate. But what, you know, it's hard to have oversight over things like bid waivers. And Tom, I'll just disagree with you a little bit. Like if we're buying off a state contract, I mean, I would not call that a bid waiver. I think the thing is when we have so many things that get lumped into this category of bid waiver, it becomes impossible to have any oversight over them. What you're really looking for is a way to truly evaluate exceptions. And we can't evaluate exceptions if all kinds of things get thrown into this bucket. So I would say, you know, carving those up into different pieces so that we can handle them appropriately from an operational and a control perspective, and also have a way to focus on the true exceptions, would be the goal to me.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to hear about tuition settlements. Like, I understand there's a process around that. Like, there's no
Right.
reason that, you know, we should have anything to do with approving that. You know, there's a negotiated settlement that's going on, and that to me is not a bid waiver. Like, a bid waiver is if, you know, a roof caves in and we have to hire someone tomorrow because, you know, we don't have time to go out and seek prices or something like that. But or a true instance of a waiver where we are, you know, deviating from established policies. So I'll just say that.
Just gonna add one thing, because I think it was mentioned about, for example, the example was given about, because it was used in a prior district. I do think there are things like that are unique to education, like professional development of staff, where there are certain established providers of that in the area that work with many districts around the state. For example, the old Center for School Change, which is now the Partners for Educational Leadership. There is established relationships around the state where they understand the districts. They come in and provide valuable professional development of staff. Now, are there probably other people that can do the same thing? Maybe, but to the extent that they're able to do it, and to the folks that they utilize that are former educators in districts around the state, would I call that a sole source? No, but as a service provider, I think there's some weight in the fact that they have developed relationships and understand the needs of Connecticut school districts, as opposed to other bigger or other organizations that will offer a menu of services, but they come in and they come out. It's a quick hit. It's a money grab, basically.
And I think,
But hold on. This conversation is getting to exactly where we have to understand with this policy, right? I don't want to debate the Center for anybody getting a sole source, or, this is not what this is about.
Right.
This is about making the policy robust enough where we can make meaningful decisions and we don't have to have these conversations every day, right? Now, the one thing a lot of people don't understand about sole source, and I think Adam will shake his head when I say this, it's not sole source meaning there's only one person in the whole entire world. It's a sole source justification. There are 5 people in the whole world that can do this, but this is why this is the best person. There's a criteria behind that, and we agree upon it, and we say, okay, so they might not be the cheapest, and they might, but they might be the best, and they might have, a reputation in the county, whatever. That's where we have to get to. So I really want to wrap this up by saying, I agree that with Lori, and I agree with Tom Bremer. Definitions are very important. When we can put this into 3 or 4 buckets, well, when we run a list, we don't get 8,000 bid waivers. It just looks bad, right? And bid waivers are actually, I think there's a charter requirement or some requirement that they have to, that the Board of Finance has to review them. And I'll tell you what, I don't want to review that list of bid waivers. Is ridiculous. I as a board member don't want to have to do that. But if we can really make solid definitions, put them into buckets that says these are real, no kidding sole source justifications, these are really no kidding bid waivers, and we can get them to numbers that make sense, I think we'll all be much better off. And I think the Board of Ed will feel like they're heard, and the purchasing director will be able to fulfill his requirement in managing the, in running the purchasing, being the purchasing authority of the town.
can I just make
Go
one
ahead,
point
Courtney,
of
please.
reference for that? And then I know you have to go. And just, I do think it's important for me to just state this for the record, just that most boards of ed, and that's why I look forward to the partnership, because I think Adam is, I think we're at a place where Mr. Bremer and Mr. Toole, and we'll look through this, but most boards of ed do exempt professional services, and that includes consultants and professional services that are education related from bidding because of the specific expertise. That doesn't mean you don't document it, but we will get to that place. We will have that conversation. We'll put it into policy or not and come back to the table. But I do think that's a big one. And that's one of the big ones that's why you're hearing so much, interesting conversation around it. I think we'll come to a good place together about that particular piece. And if we would treat our education components different than what I call Angelus's world, which is, I'm going to call it widgets and roofs and things that are standard purchasing that might not have the unique nuances that ed purchasing does. And we will substantiate that and back that up with information from our colleagues and the legal group that does write policies for boards of ed. And we'll work through that.
Yep. That's all we can expect.
Okay.
So last thing, I will set our next meeting for March 31st. Well, let me say in or about March 31st, depending on our schedules. And that meeting will be, I would hope would be a meeting for this body to say to our committee to say, okay, we've come up with the document. We can run through the document really quick. We can look at in very quick detail. Here's where we didn't agree. We don't have to talk about the things you agreed on because you agreed upon it, right? Here's where the issues are, where our committee would have to focus. And if that meeting can happen on the 20th or the 25th earlier, please let us know. But right now, I would say on or about March 31st will be our next meeting to see the final deliverable. And I know we literally didn't talk about one change in the document, but, and I know I'm limited to time today, and I apologize for that. But I felt like getting aligned. I feel like there's alignment, with the town and the Board of Ed. Mr. Testani, we appreciate your inputs. I know Mr. Tracy in the interim was trying to provide inputs, and he's a great guy, but he had a lot on his plate. But your part of this is key. Courtney's part is key, and certainly Adam and Mr. Bremer being the consigliere here, bringing everybody together so that we all don't get into a big war at the end of this. So, anyone else have any comments before I adjourn? All right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time, and we'll see you on the 31st.